And Megan Fox here at PJ Media is explaining.
What's tip 4?
Well, don't trust women. I think you just touched on that with your Dancing with the Stars.
You can still love me.
I do. I love you all the time.
Our First Amendment rights are huge. They are very important to me. They should be important to everyone.
Don't be a public official if you don't want to be filmed, ma'am.
Megan Fox.
Yes.
Good morning. Welcome to the live stream. It is an early one today because we have a very special guest coming to the program right now. Michael Volpe in Chicago is with me. We'll put him on the live stream. Mike and I have been, as you know, covering family court corruption, and it's not just a problem in the United States. We've discovered that this is a global problem, and we've been making a point to reach out to journalists who are covering these issues in all of the countries that we can find. And today coming to the program is Grant Wyeth. Grant Wyeth is a Melbourne-based writer and a columnist for the Asia Pacific Affairs publication, The Diplomat. He is formerly an academic at the Asia Institute at the University of Melbourne and a producer on Radio Australia. Grant, thank you so much for being here. It's such an honor to have you here.
That's right. Thank you for inviting me.
I would love to know, first off, how did you get interested in the family court corruption issue?
Yeah, so it's an issue that's outside my usual area of expertise, stuff that I've been working on for years. But it was something I would keep seeing these articles come up in the newspapers, and you see them quite frequently now, where man accused of sexual abuse has been awarded custody, or a mother with a drug problem has been awarded custody, or all these kind of strange articles you'd read and you'd think that's absurd. Like, what is going on with the system here? And so then I just started, I got kind of curious, and I was like, well, why is this happening? And so I started digging, and the more you dig, the more absurd it becomes, and the more you kind of realize that something incredibly wrong is going wrong with the system, and it's a global problem. So I've started, as you said, reaching out to people around the world. So, the States, in the UK, all through Europe as well. And everywhere there's similar problems everywhere. They're just having these issues where their family courts are just, they're producing the opposite result that what you would expect, like any decent human being would expect.
Right. Instead of solving problems, the family court system is creating problems, and they're creating problems for families and children, especially. Now, you wrote an article recently, and this was the one about, I'm actually not sure how recent it was. Let's see. No, I'm sorry. This was from 2020, but I wanted to ask you about it. It was called How the Family Court's Purpose to Protect Children Became Inverted. So you have this very interesting theory about how the family courts in Australia became corrupted. Why don't you tell us about Leonard Warwick? Because I guarantee you that nobody in the United States has ever heard of this guy.
Yeah, so this was a huge story in the early 80s. I was too young for it at the time, but this was a man who, he had a family court ruling against him, and he decided that he was going to take his revenge on the court. So he shot a judge on his doorstep, he blew up another judge's house and killed his wife, blew up a third judge's house and injured a judge and his children. He then blew up a family court building, which luckily had nobody in it at the time. He then blew up a church hall because the church was helping his wife and child hide from him. And this man, it was one of the great kind of unsolved crimes in Australian history. He wasn't captured until 2015. So it was 20 years after his crimes before he was even captured. And then last year he was sentenced to life in prison. But he sets up this real kind of understanding of the court, how the court has changed and how the court has actually become more sympathetic to men like him, men who would kind of use violence to achieve their purposes. The courts now kind of feel like that. Well, my theory is they feel they need to reward men like this in case they start attacking the court again. You know, the court feels like it has a kind of self-preservation here, where it says, you know, if we don't pander to these abusive men, they're going to come after us again. And that seems to be the way that these courts operate, and you know, it's to the detriment of children. I've kind of looked at this mostly. What I've been looking at is the way it kind of rewards abusive men, but I know it's not totally always abusive men that the system rewards. You know, there are there was an article that I just read of yours this evening about you know, the drug abusive mother. So you know, it's not consistently a court system that's favoring men, but it seems to be that's a trend, you know, with violent and abusive men, that they are being
What I
rewarded.
think I see is the court system favoring abusers,
Yeah.
whether or not they are male or female. And it does seem to be a majority of them appear to be male, you know, but there are also abusive females. I know we've spoken to Kenneth Rosa from the Father's Rights Movement, who his ex-wife was extremely abusive to him, calling in false police reports that are verifiably false.
Right.
You know, we've looked at all that evidence. So it just appears that the courts favor abusers.
Yeah.
Now, all three of us have actually come to the same conclusion, which I find is very interesting, about why this is and who started it. And Mike and I talk to parents all the time, which we argue with people to say, parental alienation, this theory of parental alienation is actually harming families in family court. We have parents who say, but I suffered from this. I suffer from being alienated from my children. None of us disagree that some people have been alienated from their children, if you want to, I hate even using the word, through behaviors that are not good and that are, you know, something that people do when they go through a divorce, using children against one another, whatever.
Even before the divorce.
Yeah, even before the divorce. Right. I mean, there are bad people out there in family court who treat their children poorly. To
Even
get
the
back at
good
other
people.
spouse.
I don't know if there are perfect parents, but
Right.
people probably slip up and say all kinds of things. If you ever said a negative comment about the other parent, that is a form of parental alienation.
Right.
So,
And that it's been so bastardized, though, to the point that we have these kooks, these quacks who make a lot of money doing selling this parental alienation theory to the courts. Now, Grant, you've pointed out in your reporting that pretty much everyone in the medical community and the psychological community says that parental alienation is not legitimate, it's not evidence-based, and yet the family courts continue to use it. I've seen you point this out multiple times, that it's a problem. Why don't you share with the audience your views on parental alienation and the people who use this in court?
Yeah, I mean, so my theory at the moment is that children aren't reluctant to engage with a parent for no reason at all. There are reasons for this, and the most obvious reason is usually the true one, that one of those parents has been abusive or is not a good parent, and that's why the child is reluctant to engage with them. And that's something that, you know, most normal people would say, yes, that's true. That's something we can all agree on. But if you're a court psychologist or any kind of therapist, your power in the system is related to how complicated you can make things. So if you say, if you say that, well, no, that obvious reason is not the reason. What's going on is something far more complicated. Then you have a lot of power in the system, don't you? Then,
yeah, you've just made yourself relevant. Now they need you to figure out what is this complicated thing.
The term they use when they do that is high conflict divorce. And that gives, and I think that term is used in Australia, right?
Yeah,
you hear that? Yeah, that gives them license to do whatever they want. So that's combined, that parental alienation immediately. It's a high conflict divorce. So in the US, that gives them license to appoint 2, 3 of their friends. We did a bunch of stuff in St. Louis, and it went from Podlowski, Elaine Podlowski, the guardian ad litem, to Reed, to one
Dr.
of his
Reed.
friends, and in some cases even longer. And now you got 4 or 5 people on the case, as you said, trying to fix
Racking
this
up bills.
complicated problem
Yeah.
rather than the obvious one.
And I think
So does that happen in Australia? Is the court allowed to appoint people and more than one person, and just start?
And there's more, and and oftentimes you have things where, and I think you'll find this in the States as well, where the parents have to pay for these psychological assessments themselves. When the assessment comes back and says that you're an alienator or you're a bad parent or whatever, and you're having to pay for evidence against you. I mean, it's a crazy kind of system. It's a real kind of corrupted market around the family court. And I think the other kind of thing that I think is insane about the whole parental alienation thing is that the parental alienation experts, I should say, they make their whole argument is that these children are being brainwashed by one parent. The irony is that with their court assessments and with the actions that they ask the courts to take, and with things like family bridges and all these reunification camps, it's actually them who's doing the brainwashing.
Yep.
Right. And as we found out recently, Family Bridges itself has this thing, moratorium, where you can't talk about the past. What are you doing if not brainwashing them? In fact, like I guess really effectively by trying to say, forget what happened to you, which almost always is the abuse, and they have the moratorium. And you're absolutely right. They are trying to convince these kids they're not being abused.
That is brainwashing.
Happened in almost all of these cases, even in Burkhardt v. Atkins. They're basically trying to convince the kids that their mom has done nothing wrong, that if you feel like you shouldn't have a relationship with her, it's your fault, not her fault. And I don't know if it's called brainwashing, but it's certainly manipulation.
You probably don't know this part about it, Grant, but in that case that I sent you to read about, they had a therapist who wanted to starve the children for a day so that they understood what it was like to be a drug addict. Can you imagine? And a physician said, this is child abuse. And dad got held in contempt of court for not sending his children to this quack.
Right. Look, I've had women tell me that they have been cited for hugging their kids too much because their ex wasn't that kind of physically endearing. And that would alienate the ex because you're showing so much affection. Like that's another thing that I can't stand about parental alienation. Everything becomes parental alienation. We should play it, but the lady, and I'm going to forget her name, but in one of the videos, she said, if you give the child a toy, but it's right before you switch to the other parent, that's parental alienation, because it's like you're saying, here's the toy, only you can't have it. And I remember sending her an email and going, if you're the other parent, why don't you just buy the kid the same toy then?
Right.
Just spend the $20
and get the same toy.
But,
Yeah, Grant, tell me too. You had you wrote a lot about Richard Gardner, who is the father of parental alienation syndrome. Do you have acolytes in Australia who are following this man's psychotic theories, and who are they? Because I'm starting to think I need to follow all of these quacks around the world. We need to start making a list. Who are the parental alienation experts in Australia that are being called on by courts to testify?
Yeah, well, I don't have a list off the top of my head, but it's definitely, they're definitely there, and they're definitely influential.
But his theories are still propagated.
Yeah, I mean, he's the most influential figure in every family courtroom. Every family courtroom you go into, the ghost of
in the world. And folks, you should know he supposedly killed himself. I got a copy of his autopsy, and apparently committed suicide by stabbing himself 3 times here and then 4 times here.
Oh my, That's
Apparently, that's a suicide.
that's
No one
that's
could
nuts.
explain to me how they determined that to be a suicide. He lived a seedy life, very shadowy, and he died the exact same way. I don't know if that was a suicide. It seems like it's a murder, but I don't know what happened. But yeah, and this is the guy they are pushing as like the grand poobah of all of this stuff.
So, Grant, do you have? Is there anybody who's real popular in Australia that these people call on for a parental alienation expert?
Yeah, I wouldn't know off the top of my head. Again, sorry about that. I mean, I've kind of been working more in the kind of more in the ideas space about what are the ideas that are driving this, rather than the actual.
I know that there are members in Australia, but the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts,
and
that comes up.
They're everywhere. And
Right.
they have
Interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
Find making divorce pay. I don't want to brag, but I basically set the standard on their research. But that is it. They are the ones doing it. I think they are the main reason why it's global, because it's their research and essentially their family court, because it's family court judges, family court lawyers, family court psychiatrists all over the world. So who is AFCC if it's not family court? But what's crazy, they pump out the parental alienation research, but what they do, what's really insidious, is there's also research that says a guardian ad litem is great. No, by the way, here are a bunch of guardian ad litems from our organization you can choose from. Parenting coordinator, and there's research explaining, it's basically like brochures, but how all of their alphabet soup of court actors can help. So they're the ones pumping out the parental alienation is a big problem. And here's a laundry list of our people who can solve it. And the best example is Sunny Kelly, though they didn't quite accuse her of a parental alienation, but they essentially accused her without using the term. There were 12 people appointed onto that case who were members or affiliated with AFCC. This is basically like the standard. Accuse her of it and then appoint our people to try to fix it. It was the same thing. Make the case complicated, which introduced every new set of person. And before you know it, over $1 million in fees.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
I was going to say, and I think this is the problem. There's a kind of incestuousness to the system, and there's a whole. I've previously described it as, there's a term in economics called a repugnant market, which is like when a market forms around something that you would call unethical or amoral. So something like, slavery was an unethical market, a repugnant market. And the family court has become this repugnant market. And, all the incentives around the court are designed to basically help the actors who profit from the court. They're not designed to help the children, which, or they're not designed to help both partners come to an amicable agreement. They want more conflict between parents. Conflict between parents is good for their wallets. So all the incentives around the court are just backwards.
Now let's talk about the media. When you first discovered this and you wanted to do some stories, how did the Diplomat and the places you work at, they embrace it? Were they resistant?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I published, I couldn't find an outlet for it as well. So that was the piece on Leonard Wyeth that you mentioned before. And so I just put it up on Medium myself. And then all of a sudden I got flooded with people saying,
yep,
this is happening to me. This is, and people saying, directing me to more research, directing me to more articles on this. It was really something that really kind of took off. And I realized, hang on, it's even bigger than I thought it was. It's affecting so many people, and so many people are out there who, also a lot of people who are gagged by the system, where, they'll write me messages on Twitter and they'll say, this is happening to me, but I'm not allowed to talk about it at all, and it's really, the system kind of suppresses any exposure of it as well. things obviously get out and it gets out, but I feel like, it's only the tip of the iceberg.
So what's the rules? Are these proceedings recorded? Are you allowed to record them? Can you put something like that on YouTube? Are there like Australian family court hearings that somebody can find on YouTube or another platform like that?
There are published rulings, but a lot of the details are obviously suppressed because they say, oh, it's in the interest of the child. This is the way they get out.
And it's privacy they use, right?
Yeah, and they say, oh, we're defending the privacy of the child.
And they have a similar law. They have a similar law in England.
Yeah,
where almost nothing gets out.
Yeah, there's a secrecy act.
And then what I call the mainstream media. I know I've seen at least a few things on like Australian Broadcasting Corporation about this, but how much coverage does this get in the media in Australia? Is it reaching the mainstream or not necessarily?
It is, but my kind of theory about this as well is that it's so absurd that it's the perfect cover for it, because you can read articles about this, but you don't believe it because, the courts can't be acting this way because, we think the courts are generally doing the right thing, but it's not true. So, but there is more being more being understood about this. And there's been some really high profile, family court failings here in Australia recently where
and there have been kids who were killed, right, as a result of this.
And who set his wife and children on fire in a car. There was another man who jumped off a bridge with his baby, after he had been awarded unsupervised visitation, so there's been some really high profile cases that have really brought it to the public's attention. But there's also, a lot of people who don't want to change the system,
And I'm not sure exactly how it fits in, but in Australia, there are laws that say 50-50 is supposed to be the presumed best.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's the problem with the system, because the system it's all about contact. So contact. And it doesn't matter what the parent has done, whether they're sexual abuse or violent or drug problem. The goal of the court is always to have contact. And that's why, something like parental alienation is very handy for these judges, because it gives them an excuse to create contact.
And you're talking about when you say it doesn't matter, it's all about contact, and it doesn't matter what the parent has done. And that is, I can illustrate that very, very easily. In Missouri, in Ripley County, Missouri, in Haynes v. Haynes case, we have a convicted child sodomizer whose daughter, who he abused, killed herself at 14. And the remaining daughter, who is 12, and she killed herself because the court forced her into visitation with him. The remaining daughter, who is 12, is still in court because he's fighting for some kind of jail visitation. I call them masturbatory visits. That's what this guy wants, because she is the age now that he starts abusing. He's abused at least three girls, all when they started becoming the age that she is, 12. And his lawyer, his scumbag lawyer, is actually arguing in front of a judge that he needs jail time visits with this child. And that's against Missouri law. It's against the law because he's a child sex offender. He's not allowed to be within 100 feet of a child, but his own child, they don't care about. And I guarantee you, they're going to give him this. The judge has already silenced the mother's lawyer, refuses to hear any of her motions, and is hearing motions from the other side and ruling on them at 10:30 at night. What does that tell you? These are people who, and you think this can't happen in America? It can't happen to you? Can't happen?
It is.
Oh, yes, it can. Oh, yes, it can. And I found out that contact, this idea of contact, and this is why 50-50 is so dangerous, is that if you elevate the idea that parents have a right to 50-50 custody, no matter what the law says, even if the law says, except in circumstances where there's law breaking, the judges won't listen to it.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I watched some MPs speaking out against it. There is a movement in the parliament to change that law, right?
Yeah, there is a movement, and luckily, there's been one MP who's been the real driver of
Correct.
this.
Is that correct?
No, his name's Kevin Andrews, and he's actually lost his pre-selection, which is like a primary, so he won't be in the next parliament after the next election. So he's been the real kind of the cog in the wheel here, in terms of he's always tried to prevent any kind of reform in the family court. He's I guess a contact obsessive. He just believes, he's very much this idea that the household is a place where a man's authority is absolute, and if men beat their children, well, they that the children shouldn't be acting up. That's
good God.
So
Right.
So luckily he'll be gone when the next election comes around. And maybe that will bring about some more.
And there's Pauline Hanson. I don't know if she backed the contact, but she's very father's rights, from my understanding.
Yeah, it's because one of her sons has not been given access. He's got convictions for violent abuse,
God.
and it's one of these strange things. So
it's always the people with the personal experience, if you notice, like Dorsey Pruder, she's this, parental alienation, and supposedly she was alienated from her father, and that's why she's into this. And then Childress, they all have their own personal story, which is what turns them into this like crusader for this, and they just assume
before she became a crusader
else
for
is
this,
doing
though,
it.
she was in mortgages. So obviously her personal experience did not stop her from getting another job. So you should know about Dorsey. She used to do mortgages.
This is upsetting.
Like this guy, Fred Davis, who does Parental Alienation. I talked to him like 3 years ago, but 25 years before then, he was developing real estate. How does that happen? You get
like Grant said, it's the repugnant market, right? It's like what we call these cottage industries. They find a way. They see there's a way to make a ton of money. That's what this is about. Dorsey Pruder is making way more money doing this than she did in mortgages. I guarantee you. She gets $500 an hour for a phone call. She gets $5,000 to put kids in her reunification weekend program. God knows what that involves. I know what I wanted to ask you, Grant. Does Australia have reunification camps like Family Bridges, like we have here?
Unfortunately, it doesn't have those here. Not that I know of, anyway. But they're not prominent as.
But it does have like a laundry list of therapy options.
Yeah, so there are therapists who court orders will order therapists. Order families to go to therapists in order to find ways to reconcile. It's all about this contact and making making children overcome their fear of a parent that they have for probably good reasons. Trying to it was one thing that
in essence, that's the brainwashing, the actual brainwashing.
And it was one thing when you were talking about the sex offender before, it was one thing I was going to say that and this is it speaks to how poorly children are treated in the system, that a woman would never be told that she has to live with a man who has raped her, but the child does get told this.
Right. Yes.
It's not.
What Elaine Pudlowski has actually said, that's in the past. That happened in the past. We need to get past this.
Did he stick his thumb up your butt?
Did he stick his finger up her butt? I don't know.
And
he says he didn't. She says he did. We have to get past all this. They acknowledge that trauma happened, and their solution is, we're just going to get past it through some therapy. We're going to get you some therapy, and it won't matter anymore that your dad sodomized you because we went to Dr. Reed and worked it out, and now you get unsupervised visitation with the monster. I mean, no one cares about these kids. The only thing anybody cares about in the family court system is the access to the parent and the money that they're getting by providing that access to the parent.
How much of this becomes very like deliberate excuse making number one for the abusive parents. We played that thing, and then also just twisting yourself into knots to try to come up with reasons why abuse happened. The thing we played last week was is Danielle Jesser versus Jeff Tharrington. The guy, I got like a laundry list of things he's been accused of: throwing his kid while he was in a car seat, putting him into a dog cage, came back with the bruise, and he said he got hit with a big stick. And the lady said something like, well, he's got a lot more toys, so that probably explains why there's more bruises. That's sort of excuse making and justification. It's a lot of that, right?
Yeah, and I think that's, again, the incentives of the system. The incentives of the system are always to downplay or ignore or excuse any kind of bad behavior, bad parental behavior. And, well, I shouldn't say bad parental behavior because, parents are never going to be perfect. But, actual damaging behavior, serious violence, serious sexual assault, serious, exposing children to horrible things, drug abuse and whatnot. These things, there's always an incentive in the system to try and overlook or find excuses for these things.
All right. So the other question that people always ask who aren't in the system, most of this is crime. So what happens, I guess, dynamics, if it's if the allegation is made during family court, do the police take a hands-off approach, or what happens to these allegations? So what I'm saying is, if the guy's physically abusing the kid, how come the cops aren't stepping in to arrest him and just bypassing family court?
Yeah, I mean, there are cases where the cops don't believe these stories as well. The cops, we had there was another case here in Australia where a woman, she tried to go to the cops and say, look, my ex-husband, he's dangerous. And the cops just, they actually said, oh, she's trying to set up a claim for the family court. They basically said that this is what she's trying to do. She said, so she can say,
so
I went to
the cops
without even investigating it.
Without an investigating.
Right.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Without generalizing too much, the cops seem to way too much take a far too skeptical view of anyone bringing forward allegations if they find out you're in a divorce and custody at that same time, right? And that's exactly what happens in the U.S.
And Grant actually, wait a minute, Grant actually wrote an article called How Australia's Family Courts Are Failing Children. And Grant, there were some statistics in that. You want to talk about the statistics of the false reports?
Yeah, so it was basically saying that judges only believe accusations of abuse or child sexual abuse in 14% of cases, which I think in the article of yours, Megan, that I read this evening,
number is much less.
It's only about 4% are generally seen to be.
It's actually less than 4. It's like 3 point something. I mean, children just do not lie about sexual abuse.
Adults, it's a lot harder to tell. Yeah. But children very rarely lie. It happens.
But what these recent findings in Australia found that in 3/4 of the cases where there are allegations of abuse, the person that is being alleged as the abuser has got more access to the child, and in 17% of the cases, they've got the full custody.
Full custody change, yeah, and that's what we're seeing happen.
And that's the crazy thing. Even though contact is supposed to be the key,
they end up switching custody and alienating the other parent.
They give sole custody anyway, and that's part of the scam. Paul Reitman was involved in the Rucky case. That was the point I made to him. It was like, you did such a bang-up job that this parental alienation case, mom hasn't seen the child since 2013. And that happens all the time. Look, the Rucky case, she wound up being criminally convicted, so that's what they use against her. But if you're the kids refuse to see dad, you force them by putting them into a cop car. But then, I guess, reunification with mom, isn't
Nobody
necessary.
cares about that. Yeah.
Right.
So if you take them totally away from the other parent, the
Mhm.
court doesn't do anything to reunite them with that parent. It's
Right.
just, it's absolutely sickening. David Segui is going through the same thing. He
Mhm.
was supposed to have no contact for 90 days, and it's
a lot
been
longer than that.
way more than 90 days. And the court isn't doing anything to reunify him with his children that they stole from him, that they
Right.
put into abusive reunification camp, Family Bridges, where the kids are crying and going to the media and saying we're being abused. It's a horrific situation, just horrific.
Now, Grant, libel or I don't know what is the threat of lawsuits significant with a story like this?
No, not in Australia. I mean, as long as you can provide evidence.
Not anymore. So is it more significant than the other work you do?
It would be more significant, but I mean, I'm careful to make sure that everything I say is backed up with evidence, and no one can actually.
Right. Look, I am too, but I've had editors tell me still no.
Yeah.
I don't know how
Nobody
significant
likes
it
to
is.
start a fight with lawyers. Okay,
Yeah.
nobody
No,
likes
I
to
know
do that,
yes.
except us for some reason. I don't.
I'm careful also, and there is a way to back everything up.
Yeah.
Here's the problem in the U.S. That may stop you from losing a lawsuit. It doesn't stop you from being sued. Person can still file a law. They can't file a lawsuit if no article was published.
Yeah.
But once the article is and the lawsuit takes a long time, and then get into discovery, even if you get out of it, you're still paid a lot in lawyers. I know in the U.S. that's one of the reasons why far less people than should be covering it cover it.
We have somebody we've got somebody in the comments section who I wanted to read their comment, because this is just another example of what these courts are doing to families. And she says she's fighting DSS and CPS. They programmed my grandchildren with Sesame Street videos on how to have a relationship with a parent that is incarcerated, their father. He was just sentenced to life in prison for the murder of their mother. The children were in the home the night of the murder. He directed the children to cover up the crime to the police, all verified in trial transcripts. And they're forcing these children to have a relationship with their father who murdered their mother. This is, like you said, Grant, no judge, no jury would force a woman to have a relationship with her rapist or her attempted murderer. And yet here we have forcing children. Oh my God, I just can't even anymore with these people.
I read several months ago up in Alaska where the same thing was happening, where a man had murdered his wife, and then he was applying for full custody, and the social services were actually working for him and believing that he was the best person to be.
Now, Australia has their version of child protective services or social services, right?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
And so when they must get involved when these abuse allegations happen. They're a part of the system, a part of the cover up generally.
Yeah. I think so. I mean, I think they still are kind of suffering from, there's a lot of suspicion that goes towards people who allege abuse rather than the abuser. It's just, there's something within the system that, they don't want to, and especially so Indigenous women, Aboriginal women are finding this a lot, is when they complain about, that their partners are violent and whatnot, they find themselves often the ones who are losing custody and even put in jail. They're deemed the troublemaker.
Right.
It's a really strange phenomenon.
We have a couple of comments in the comment or questions for you, Grant, in the comment section, which is a little off topic, but they're all curious because you're in Australia. They want to know if there's really COVID camps there, and they want to know how bad is the lockdown.
Yeah, so there's no COVID camps. There is. So the government does make you go into a quarantine if you do arrive back in the country. So I think that's kind of been. And usually, so I actually arrived back in the country in May. I'd been in Iceland for 6 months, but they give you a nice hotel. I was in a kind of nice 4-star hotel where I had to stay there for a couple of weeks to make sure I didn't have the virus. So there's a kind of strict quarantine, but they're not camps.
Hotels, more like hotels.
Yeah, more like hotels. And then the lockdowns are proving, I guess, difficult. So here in Victoria, my state, we're in a lockdown at the moment, where you can only kind of leave your house for kind of essential items.
And are they tracking you on the app?
They're not tracking you, but you do have to like use a QR code. If you go to the supermarket, you have to sign in with a QR code.
Wow.
And interestingly, just a bit off topic there, and this has caused a big scene because now the police are using that data to track criminals, and it's being used, where, the government didn't write in anything to the legislation that said, the police can't use your data if you're just going to the supermarket as part of their investigation. So there's a real kind of privacy problem going on here with that now.
Interesting.
And
Interesting. They don't care about privacy there. Just
in the court system where they're screwing the kids.
Their use of privacy is not that consistent. Hey, I wanted to have some fun, Grant. I wanted to ask you, the parental alienation people, I want you to respond to the arguments I hear the most, because I'm tired of answering them.
Yeah.
All right. I don't know why you say that parental alienation isn't real. It happened to me. I'm in Australia. How can you say it's not real?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it starts with a bogus theory. So it's really, Richard Gardner had an idea that he wanted to prevent sexual abuses of children from facing any consequences from their behavior. And it's branched out in different ways now, but it really starts with that idea, and it still contains that kind of kernel of his intentions,
Mm-hmm.
in it. So it's more a counterclaim now than an actual phenomenon. It's a way for you to, obscure a custody proceeding. It's not really. I wouldn't say that it's not. Obviously, there are parents who do behave badly in this way, some of them, but in the legal system, it's used as a legal tactic. It's not a phenomenon.
Right.
It's a legal tactic.
I know parental alienation is real. There's like 1,000. I just got this in Scotland. Are you saying we're all lying?
Yeah.
I love it. I love the emails you get, Mike. They're funny.
Yeah,
but I'm in Scotland. Are we all lying?
When you must hear that. I know 1,000 parents in the same situation.
Yeah. I mean, people extrapolate their own kind of personal circumstances and claim it's kind of universal in a way. But there are a lot of people who, I probably, and I do try to sympathize with some of these people who I do get comments from, and, because, it is kind of difficult being separated from a child, but a lot of these people are not willing to look at their own behavior. They're just, they refuse to accept that they've behaved poorly in any way, or
yes,
dangerously.
this is a major problem.
Even when they haven't, their stories are so different. How do you all get to say it's parental? And here's my favorite one. You just don't understand abuse. That's why you don't believe parental alienation is real.
Yeah, and Grant is not the person to say that to, because Grant has done a lot of research into domestic abuse and
Right.
So what do you say, Grant, when someone says to you that you're not sympathetic to abuse victims? You don't know about abuse.
Well, I mean, my kind of definition of abuse is usually violence or sexual abuse or any kind of these direct, kind of physical violence. And I think, we're starting to get a bit of an understanding of coercive control now as well, where you have things like, I've spoken to a woman where she wasn't, her husband gave her only a small amount of money to spend, in a week. And if she spent over that, he would become abusive to her and whatnot. And things like these little things where
stalking, cell phone tracking.
Yeah, cell phone tracking and all that. So, I mean, these are kind of abusive behaviors as well. But I mean, this whole idea that you're being denied access for your child for reasons that you don't believe are real. I mean, that's not a real form of abuse, I don't think.
Right now, we get this a lot. Do you hear experts try to say parental alienation is as bad as even sexual abuse or physical
One guy
abuse.
said
No, but
it's
do you
even
hear
as
the
bad. It's
do you,
worse than it's worse than beheading a child. That you could that
do you
it's
hear
worse than
the
anything.
do you
Yeah.
hear that from like the so-called experts? Do you hear that
Yes.
cited?
I'm not sure if you read this case. There was a case in January that I got the transcript from Pittsburgh, and it had Dr. Evans, who's a kind of notorious.
But do you
parental-
hear that in Australia though? Do you hear it from like that parental alienation community?
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
that
You
right?
hear that, but in this transcript, the lawyer was asking him, what's worse than parental alienation, and the lawyer was saying, is giving a child a black eye worse than parental alienation? He's saying yes, it is. I mean, no, parental alienation is worse than that. Is sexually abusing a child, is parental alienation worse than? He's like, yes, it's worse than. He was just
There was
really
nothing that was off limits. That was
Yeah.
the lawyer Ducote. His last name is Ducote.
yeah,
He's
exactly.
a good
And
lawyer, and that transcript is
Evans-
really amazing because
and it was
he gets
Evans-
all the way to beheading, and the guy
Right.
cannot say that parental alienation
Is less.
is less bad than beheading a child. It's
Because his income
insane.
depends on maximizing the effect of
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
I talked with Bill Burnett, who's another like expert in it, and he's like, there's lots of alienating behaviors. Parental alienation is relatively unusual. The problem is no one can tell you the difference between alienating behaviors, which, as I said, almost every parent at some point is going to do, and when does that cross over? And what they want is they want to be the experts to be brought in to decide, and then their pocketbook is dependent on maximizing the number of times they decide whatever the situation is actually parental alienation, specifically in that specific case. If you're brought in and you're supposed to decide if there's parental alienation, you're one of these experts, is Paul Reitman, and you say, no, this looks like abuse. Well, you're done. You get a small paycheck and you're moving on to the next case. If you say it is, at a minimum, you maybe recommend your friend what he did in the Rucky case. Maybe you are recommended. You start the ball rolling.
Yeah.
It's such a financial conflict of interest.
It is. I was
And-
talking to someone the other day who actually was used as an expert in a divorce case once. She's a nurse, and she was called on to evaluate the effects of a drug on a mother who had been taking this drug for medical reasons, and she didn't realize that they were going to try and use her to discredit this mother. And when they did it to her on the stand, she thought, I will never do this again because I will never use, I never want to be used to do this to someone, and what a racket this is. And she had an interesting thing to say. She said, maybe if there's a custody dispute, the people who should be called on as experts should be the people who know the family, teachers who are mandated reporters, the people who are already in their lives, pastors, teachers, people, neighbors who know them, who actually interact with this family, maybe would be better than someone you just paid to be an expert, who then you can twist whatever it is they're saying to discredit this one or that one. And it's monetarily induced, like it's a monetary opportunity for someone to make money on this, instead of just calling witnesses who know this family, who are not paid, who are just asked, what is your opinion as an expert, as a teacher on little Billy's family situation? Even that might be fraught with some danger too, but my God, it just seems like they have set this up.
But in Australia, or in the courts you've covered, more times than not, these experts that the court brings in are given more weight than the witnesses that are called by each of the parents.
Yeah, definitely. And, submissions from, grandparents, or submissions from teachers or whatnot. I mean, these are just not given weights. The court always
goes to the experts.
And some of them have only met with the children one time. In case, in Elaine Pudlowski, all these cases, and by the way, there's a new lawsuit against her. We'll have to bring that up tomorrow. But in all these cases, their parents are reporting she met with the children one time before she did her custody assessment, before she wrote her report. How does a person who has met your kid once, and sometimes not at all, in some of these cases, she never met the children. She never spoke to them. So how does somebody like that come in and know more than your pastor or your neighbor or your teacher it's outrageous that and she gets $30,000 to do this. $30,000 per person.
Now, Grant, one other thing, people always say, well, just appeal. So explain,
No.
if you're in Australia and you are the target of one of these terrible rulings, how easy is it to appeal, and what happens?
I mean, there is a mechanism to appeal, obviously, in Australia, but it just engages you more in the system. You know, the system is designed to keep parents.
But can you do the appeal and have any chance of winning for, say, 500 Australian dollars?
No. I mean,
No.
you can't do it cheaply. That's the thing. You can
Right.
appeal,
So
but
any appeal that has any chance of victory, you've got to have 10,000 minimum,
Yeah.
probably more than that.
yeah,
Right.
you've got to fork out a lot of money
Right.
to appeal. You know, and this is what the whole system's incentivized to keep parents engaged in the system. That's
system.
what it's about. It's about keeping them engaged in the system for as long as possible. You know, because that's, you know, it's unfortunately, you know, it's a money-making scheme, you know, from
And
children's lives.
the lawyers now, how does it, are there lawyers in Australia who specialize in divorce and custody, or
Yeah, definitely. You know, just in the
and
States.
they have a good or bad reputation?
I mean, yeah, they have a not great reputation, but
Right.
Similar
But-
to here.
yeah, similar to here. But yeah, you know, there are people, and you'll see them advertise, you know, now specialists in parental alienation and
Oh
whatnot. You know,
God.
they've found that market as well.
Right.
You know,
Right. And
Wait,
so
so
it
what's-
is like an industry around the term, around the whole custody issue.
I didn't know AFCC was global. That
AFCC is
Yeah,
global. They had
That
a
makes
bigwig judge. He might have retired since.
I think we have the answer
big-
now as to
right.
why this is global, because
no,
if
there's no
AFCC
question.
is global,
If they are not,
they're putting out these
Right.
theories, and they are putting out this training. They're the ones doing this all
Right.
across the world.
they
then, in
are
that
at a
case.
minimum a strong supporting player, if not the main reason
I
why
wonder
it's global.
if they have much of a presence in Spain, because Spain is the country that just recently outlawed parental alienation in
Yeah,
their
yeah.
court system. Grant,
Yeah.
do you
Are
know much
you-
about that? Have you followed that story?
I mean, I've followed it. They seem to have created a new children's law there, which has kind of outlook. They've recognized that parental alienation is a really nefarious concept in the system, and they've also made it a lot easier for children to be able to speak themselves and to be taken seriously as well, where judges are now compelled to take the testimony of children seriously, whereas you know, here as well, it's very difficult to get a child to speak for themselves. You know,
Our judges don't take the testimony.
Yeah,
They
they
won't. They refuse. In
Yeah.
Burkhart v. Adkins, those children have petitioned the judge to speak in front of him,
Right.
to talk to him. He has refused to hear them. How is that even? I don't even know how that's legal. If a child, especially a teenager, we're talking about in Washington State, where they are allowed to have an abortion without parental authority. They're allowed to get hormones. They're allowed to do all kinds of things. They have to sign away their medical releases for anyone to see them at 13. But they can't speak to a judge who's deciding their fate. It's outrageous. And we should. If you want to talk about laws, we should have a law that says if a child wants to talk to a judge, the judge must hear them.
Right.
Yeah.
You know what's
So I'm
interesting?
hoping that- I was going to say, so hoping that this law in Spain, which makes it far easier for children to be able to speak for themselves, you know, especially if they're teenagers or, you know, who know what they're doing. Hopefully that cascades now and other countries start to realize that this is, but
it's going the other way in some. I know they're at least trying to make it criminally illegal to be a parent alienator in Brazil, and some other countries are looking at it that way. What I was going to say is my favorite journalist is Nellie Bly. She lived in the 1800s, and they actually, it wasn't her dad, but her mom, after her dad died, married another guy. She was required to testify because he was physically and a drunk, and she laid it out, and it was part of actually making, because I guess at that time it was difficult to get divorced, so it was actually required. That sort of has changed. Okay, and then you followed other laws. There, we talked to Liz Perkins. They passed a domestic abuse law in England that you followed, right?
Yeah. I was looking at that because there was a movement to try and get parental alienation as a form of domestic abuse into the law, and luckily it didn't make it. Luckily, that kind of amendment got kicked out. There was still a kind of a push to get it into the domestic abuse law there, which would have been, horrible.
But what I was told is it's used as liberally, parental alienation, as a form of counterattack, the way you described. By the way, when the World Health Organization rejected parental alienation, that's basically what they said, that this isn't really a psychological term, it's more a judicial tool.
Yeah,
but it's basically the problem is relatively the same in England as in Australia and in the US.
Yeah,
the dynamics.
I wanted to ask you too. So what is next for you? What are you looking into coming up? What sorts of issues in the family court system or other issues are you looking into that we will be seeing from you coming up here soon?
Yeah, so I've got a piece that I've been trying to get published at the moment, which I'm trying to look at a kind of wide angle lens on this, and so what I'm trying to still look at parental alienation and what I've kind of been looking at is that parental alienation has kind of come up as a reaction to no-fault divorce. So in the 1970s, no-fault divorce became prevalent, all through the States and here in Australia as well. And that really minimized the power that abusive people had in marriages, because previously you had to give a reason why you wanted a divorce, and the authorities would say, oh, well, that's not a real reason, or that's not real abuse or whatever. And so no fault divorce made it a lot easier to escape an abusive marriage, and parental alienation seems to be the counterforce to that, a way of bringing kind of a legal control back for abusive people, a way of saying, well, you think you're going to escape from me, well, here's a tool I can use.
And that's exactly how it's being used, as a tool to abuse the ex-spouse through the court system. I mean, look at Haynes v. Haynes. She's been trying to divorce a child sodomizer for 11 years. 11 years. So, I mean, it's just, it's absolutely a tool. I'm glad you're going to be writing about that. Please send it to me when it's done, because
I think we got
love
time
following
for
what you do.
one or two more questions. And one other thing I found in the U.S., there's a lot of what I call funding streams, which is laws that create funds that are made available that create these perverse incentives. We have fatherhood.gov, other ones. Is there stuff like that in Australia that there's government money that seems to be available that actually makes it more of an incentive to do this stuff?
Yeah, I think so. And there have been these programs as well, these kind of good parenting programs, which are designed to kind of, there are some good intentions about rehabilitating, bad parents, which I think is important, but in the end that becomes the incentive, and it's again all
so you want to believe parental alienation, then you can get them into these programs that are government available. That's a huge part of the problem. If somebody's chasing money, their incentive is completely different than doing the right thing.
We have a commenter who has a recommendation for you, Grant. She says, have you considered looking at the cases here in the U.S. against the backdrop of adverse child events from the CDC? So that's interesting to me too, because the data will reveal some interesting stuff. And I do think that maybe in the fight for this, against this parental alienation, is a real deep look at the data, because like we're seeing, like you've been reporting, what is actually going on in family court versus what is actually true. I mean, here we have judges not believing children, and yet children rarely lie about abuse. And so anyway, that was just a suggestion from her.
Last question, data, is it available? And then how much data is available? Like if you call the government and say, in custody trials, how often did the man get custody, and how often do they have to?
Because we can't get that. We can't get that information.
So even this study that I wrote about recently was still a very small sample. So it was only, I think, 107 cases. So it's still very difficult to get a hold of a lot of, significant.
So the government is neither required nor really collecting very much data on any of this stuff. Am I right?
I assume it's somewhere, but it's not public.
But if you ask, they don't give it to you.
We found
Like,
out that they're not even keeping the data. Like,
right?
really?
Can you
the data
can
that
you-
we want, like the data that we're trying to get, which was, okay, I want a list of here's a list of the judges. I want to know how many times they handed custody over to dad versus mom.
Right,
They're
they
not
don't have-
keeping that. They're not
Yeah.
there, and they do it purposefully, because if they did, it would be subject to our FOIA laws, and then we would get it.
Right.
And so there's a lot of this
So there's-
intentional not keeping of data,
Yeah.
Right,
which
so let's
should
make
be
sure
stopped.
there is very little, if any, government data that's available to the public on any of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it exists somewhere, but
But
if the
if you
accessibility-
can't get it, it's not
Yeah.
available.
Yeah,
If
not
they've
available.
got it in a file somewhere, that's
Yeah.
different.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
It's
Well,
the Pentagon Papers did nothing for anyone until it was published in the Washington Post, and no one in the military wanted it published. So,
I want to just say thank you, Grant Wyeth. Thank you for being here. We sure appreciate you, and we love following your work. And it's great to connect with other journalists across the world who are looking into the same phenomenon that we have found, that we are with this family court corruption. And we sure appreciate what you do. So I hope that we can have you back sometime and keep us updated.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much for inviting me on. And likewise, I've learned a lot from following your work as well, both of you. So it keeps me in the loop of what's going on in the States as well. So yeah, and I had a really good time chatting with you.
All right, us too. Thank you so much, Grant. Michael, you and I will be back here tomorrow.
Mhm.
And
I
at
got
11?
3 nominees for Scumbag Lawyer of the
3?
week.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Well, I need to come
It's
up with
gonna
my
be like a
nominees
multiple
then.
choice.
I've got another one. I've got one too. So
No,
we'll
it'll be
have
great.
4.
We'll do like a multiple choice and say
Okay.
who do you like the best. So,
All right.
we'll be back tomorrow. We've got a good guest from Wake County. That's in North Carolina. We've talked a little bit about Wake County, and then you're
Yeah.
going to hear another case out of there. So we'll be back tomorrow. We're fake journalists, but somehow we scored Grant Wyeth from Australia to talk about the global issues in family court. So
Yeah.
that's for our critics. Every time I get someone around the globe, we're fake journalists. Who
Well,
somehow
I'm
scored
very
this one.
encouraged. I'm very encouraged by it. I'm very encouraged by the fact that there are these journalists in other countries who are really starting to blow the lid off of this stuff
It's
as well. I mean,
the
it's
global revolution.
it's bubbling up. It's
Right.
bubbling
No,
up.
it is. It is. And everyone you talk to who's a journalist will, regardless of what they say in the media, will say something like, but in the last few years, we've seen more.
Much more.
coverage.
Yeah, and it was interesting. He said the same. Like, look at how the first article he ever wrote, he had to put on Medium,
Right.
and now all of a sudden it's on the Diplomat. It's in the
Mhm.
it's in the Guardian. It's
Mhm.
everywhere. So
Mhm.
that's very good. All right, everybody, take care. I got to run, and we'll see you
So do I.
tomorrow.
All right.